This is Karen with newclevelandradio.net, and it is time for Avoid the Maze. You know, the maze is just our journey through life. And if we're lucky, we can just go down a straight path and be happy for the rest of our life and never run into a brick wall. But I don't really think that's possible. And if it is, I'd like somebody to show me that path, because I think all of us would like to just sail through life. But instead, we maneuver and we learn from each other. And my guest today is Ian Williams from Still Point Insight. And Ian, when I read your bio in podmatch.com, it was similar to others that I've read, except for the fact that at a young age, you've gone through so much, and now you're here really succeeding. And for many of us, we think to ourselves, that only happens, if you have a pile of money someplace or influence of other people. But sometimes it's just a lot of hard work to get to where you want to go. So give us a little bit of background.
Yeah, well, I appreciate the kind words. I think it depends on what your definition of success is and looks like. Yeah, we can go back as far as you want to go back. The abbreviated version is that right around the age of 13, I started using drugs and alcohol, and that led to 12 years of substance use. So if there's anybody listening who has a history or background or is currently dealing with substance use and abuse, perhaps this episode will bring them a little bit of hope, light at the end of the tunnel. So basically at the beginning of adolescence, all the way through early adulthood, really some formative years that were blunted, if not stunted, by that drug and alcohol use. And it just led to a lot of inner turmoil. And that inner turmoil, I think, eventually led me down the path of self-discovery. There were a few pivotal moments on that path, and we can dive into those if you want to. But ultimately, what I realized was, if I want to not just escape this substance use, but if I actually want to heal in the process, I'm really going to need to turn inward, and I'm going to need to embrace emotional vulnerability and figure out why it is that I started using in the first place, right? And now I'm coming up, I think. It is October. So this month, it'll be 8 years in recovery. Not a huge fan of that term. Not a huge fan of the term sober either, but, haven't touched drugs and alcohol in 8 years. And that has, it's radically transformed my life, but it's been a long time coming. It's been 2 decades in the making.
So as a parent, my first question always is, how did you get access to alcohol and drugs, and what made you even want it when it was available?
Yeah, I think access is pretty, well, at least in my experience, access is almost the easiest part about it. Maybe it was where I grew up. I'm not born, but I've been raised in the Twin Cities here in Minnesota, and I grew up in a first-rung suburb, and so city life is kind of what I knew, and access was kind of the easy thing. Some of the friends that I grew up with, and it's kind of the gateway relationships, so to speak, right? But to answer the second part of your question, why did I want to start using in the first place? At the time, I didn't really know. I couldn't have articulated it at the time. But it took a few years of self-reflection and contemplation to realize that I was self-medicating for underlying depression and anxiety. I was always, for whatever reason, adamantly opposed to pharmaceutical medication. I don't know why that was the case. But it was absolutely self-medication, and as I went through that journey of self-discovery, subsequently diagnosed with ADHD, generalized anxiety disorder, depression, etc. So as you start to tease the thread a little bit, you can understand what some of those biomarkers were in terms of why I wanted to start using in the first place.
And, and again, as a parent, we try to look at our children and think, well, you don't have any reason to be depressed, which I have learned you just don't say and you do not think, because we all have reasons. We may not be able to articulate them, as you're saying, but they're there. And for somebody to deny it, such as a parent, a teacher, that can make it even worse. And so I'm sort of glad that you brought that part up, is that there was just something in you that needed something to escape into, to make you feel better. My son, at a very young age, he was 6 or 7, was diagnosed on the autism spectrum. So any medication, any drugs, anything, he ran in the opposite direction. He was terrified of them. However, his medication that he was taking under doctor's care was causing a lot of the same things that drugs and alcohol may have caused in you. So this conversation is, hey, everybody, we need to be aware. We need to understand. We need to communicate better. So I'm sure your parents tried, but there's no manual. Nobody knows what to do first. So you basically got through junior high and high school. How did you manage it with drugs and alcohol?
School school was the easiest part to get through, and that's a real privilege to be able to say that. I come from a family of educators, and there's no question, that my parents were loving and did absolutely everything they could. And I think you raised a good point, just now, which is, this isn't really, we need to destigmatize this conversation around mental health. And I think we have in the last decade or so, but I think we could still stand to do a better job of incorporating chemical dependency as a part of mental health, that conversation, right? They're not separate. For anyone who's predisposed to addictive tendencies, you don't really have a choice, right? Like, once you're in, you don't really have a choice. I knew after 2 years of substance use, I didn't want to be doing this anymore, but I didn't have the skills to stop until 12 years after I started, right? So it's a much larger conversation. And I think, to your point, doing a better job communicating around it. If there are people out there who have others in their lives who are dealing with chemical dependency, I would strongly encourage you, I would plead with you to recognize that it's not necessarily a personal choice that they're making, right? They may be powerless over that choice, and looking at them with kindness and compassion is going to be far more effective in getting them on a healing path, or helping them get to a healing path themselves, than criticizing, ridicule, etc.
It's interesting that message you just gave about kindness. We need to incorporate that throughout our whole life at all different stages. We have a tendency to want to judge each other, even when we don't have all the facts. I remember at one time, one of my sons, we thought he was his best friend, started ridiculing him about the medication he took for his autism, and basically told him he was a drug addict. And I remember sitting down with him and saying, you're not a drug addict, but you need to take this medication. And if it's not working, we need to communicate about what's not working about it. But people who don't understand it cannot be the ones who tell you if you're right or wrong. The same way, if I would have seen you dependent on drugs as a young child, it's not up to me to criticize you about it. It's trying to help you understand why, and maybe lead you in a path that would have gotten you the help that you needed. But it sounds like your parents were doing that, but there just was this chemical imbalance in you that had a starving need for what you were doing.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you hit the nail on the head, right? It's a chemical imbalance. And that's something that you don't see from the outside, right? Anyone who looked in on my life would have said, what's the deal? He's solidly in the middle class. He's got a very stable household. His parents are together. He's got a functional family. They have the family dog. He's involved in the community sports leagues and blah, blah, blah. But it's a chemical imbalance in the brain, right? I mean, this is neurobiology that we're talking about.
Right.
And unless you shine light, or until you shine light on that equation, you don't really have the full picture, right? And so that was, starting to learn about some of those things, right? When I went to college, I majored in psychology. That was one of my majors. I double majored. But starting to learn about, the very basic fundamental aspects of the human brain, neurochemicals and all of these things, physiology, and how you can change your neurobiology through certain behaviors and actions and relationships, etc., was really kind of the beginning of a different phase of the healing journey, which was much more of an intellectual approach. I had started therapy ninth grade. I mean, not long after I started using, that was one of the first things that my parents offered and encouraged me to do. And I still, 20 years later, regularly see and talk to therapists. And I've, seen a number of them for a number of different specializations and modalities. But going to college and starting to learn about the psychology component was really, it allowed me to kind of distance myself from the emotional entanglement, right? I'm using these substances because it's providing something emotionally for me that I need. But then starting to look at it from a more cerebral context was kind of the beginning of starting to develop a more well-rounded understanding of the habits, I guess you could say.
And as we know, there are many young people who are falling into drugs and alcohol because that's the environment they live in. And if that's all they know, of course they're going to follow suit. It's always the young person like yourself, well, you come from this middle-class home, everything is fine. Why? Well, again, I want to reiterate, it's the chemical imbalance. I didn't realize I had a chemical imbalance until 15 years ago. Could never understand why. My parents used to just say, oh, she's a crier. But my mood swings were up and down all the time. And I finally was talking to a therapist, and I said to the therapist, this isn't normal. Why is if somebody across the room looks at me in a certain way, do I cry or do I run out of the room? I said, okay, maybe as a little kid, I can understand that. But what about when I was a teenager? What about as a young adult? What about now when I'm at midlife? And the therapist said to me, has anybody ever suggested that you may have a chemical imbalance? That when you're not running away, when you're not crying, chemicals in your body are working the way they're supposed to, but something spikes it and it goes up or reduces it. And I said, no. And it wasn't until we started to look into that I got the help that I needed. And I had family and friends say to me, you're different. What's different about you? And it's like, I don't just cry just to cry. And I don't run away from things just to run away from things. My body now is stable. So you decided as you're taking these courses, okay, I'm starting to get a better understanding. So it's now time to recover.
Well, college was, an opportunity, I think, like for many people, right, to break out and kind of explore and individuate early in adulthood. And I learned a few tools along the way, in those courses. But the real pivotal moment for me happened probably, well, it was 2013. So it was a couple years after I graduated. There was summer after sophomore year, I was living with some guys in a house, just subletting a room for the summer. We ended up inheriting this dog. Our lease came up. We had to decide where the dog was going to go, who the dog was going to live with long term. And so I ended up taking her in. And she was the love of my life. And I thought at the time, you know, if I can take care of her, if I can take responsibility for her, maybe it'll be an opportunity to also take responsibility for myself. And that was true to a certain extent. But the tidal wave of momentum at that point, you know, of chemical dependency was deeply ingrained. And anyway, so a couple years after school, you know, she wasn't the healthiest of pups for a number of reasons. There was a number of dog fights and people bites, and we did everything that we knew how as a family at the time to, you know, care for her and to fix those imbalances in her brain, right? And ultimately decided that the best decision, you know, after consulting with the vet clinic in the University of Minnesota, ultimately decided that the best thing was to let her go and put her down. And so a couple of days after we took her to the vet for the final time, I had this mystical experience laying in bed one night, and I was awake and I was staring at the ceiling, and she came in the room, and she nosed the door open. She hopped up on the bed next to me, and I could see her and I could hear her, but she didn't make an imprint on the mattress. And she curled up next to me, and she let out that patented sigh that she did every night when she crawled under the covers, right? It's time to go to bed. And I rolled over and I fell asleep instantaneously. And I woke up the next morning, and I was using journaling, and I still do, as a method of emotionally processing. And I started writing about the experience as if it were a dream, because it happened in the middle of the night. And it wasn't until, you know, 5 or 10 minutes into that journaling experience or session that I realized I was awake when that happened. And it completely shattered my lens of reality, you know, my perception of what reality was and about what was possible. You know, I jokingly say it was a good thing that I was home alone, because I had the ugliest, most cathartic cry of my life. But I think it was also, I think part of those tears were just trying to wrap my head around what had happened, you know, and that was really the pivotal moment for me, because at that point, you know, we'd had a couple months to prepare for putting her down. So it wasn't like this instantaneous thing. And I had spent those couple months thinking a lot about, what am I going to do to fill this space in my life? You know, because if I don't fill it with healthier habits, I know what I'm going to fill it with. It's going to be more drugs and alcohol, and I don't want to do that. So I had put some accountability measures in place before we let her go. And I'd committed to going to yoga once a week with my mom and my sister. And I signed up for a half marathon and full marathon the next year. And I started making some, you know, changes with my diet, et cetera. And so that experience, which I said, you know, really kind of shattered my perception of what reality was, sent me down, you know, what I would now call a spiritual path. And at the time it was, you know, I need to figure this out. Like, how could this be possible? What happened? I had all these questions that there were no answers to. And the next, you know, I mean, till now, this is almost 10 years later, just a deep immersion into mindfulness-based practices and spirituality. So yoga led to qigong, led to meditation, led to martial arts, led to tai chi. I mean, I just went all in. And those energy arts practices began to give me the tools that I needed to really be with my experience. And I wouldn't have been able, again, to articulate at the time. Hindsight's always 20/20. But I had leaned into the emotional vulnerability component. And so I was more comfortable with the emotions around it. And, you know, as mentioned, going through school and seeing therapists, I had done a lot of intellectual processing around my chemical dependency.
Sure.
But there was this missing link of a physical component, a physical understanding, you know? And that's what the energy arts brought me, an opportunity to be in my body and to actually experience what I was experiencing, as opposed to thinking about what I was experiencing or thinking about what I was feeling. So that was really, that was the turning point for me. I still used for another 2 years after finding the energy arts practices, but it was the next tool in the tool belt that I needed in order to, continue to kind of scaffold my way up and out of that, those habituated patterns. And, I think at the time, I mean, and again, if there's anyone out there who identifies with addiction, it's like, it's a life of extremes. It's kind of an all or nothing mentality oftentimes. And so I just went all in. And, arguably you could say that I became addicted to mindfulness-based practices because I practiced them compulsively. It was still very neurotic, right? All the time, but they were new and they were exciting. And they were starting to, allow me to develop the tools and the skills necessary to really kind of lever my way up and out of chemical dependency. And so I think that pivotal experience with my dog, and then the subsequent year or two of deep immersion in the energy arts, was really the time in my life, the chapter in my life when I started to see this is a real possibility. It was the first time that, within myself, I could kind of rekindle that light at the end of the tunnel and say, I actually believe I can do this. It's going to be a lot of hard work, but I believe in myself now. And that's something that I hadn't felt for, the previous 8 years.
And, I'm going to say to all the parents out there and significant others, we can be supportive, but we can't give that to you either. You have to find it within yourself to determine what recovery means for yourself. And in the beginning, when I use the word success, that's also an individualized look at how you feel about yourself. So many of us have been taught, not to talk about ourselves, not to pat ourselves on the back. And yet, if we don't, we're not going to get that angst out that is really gnawing at us. And it is trying to find the reasons for where we are and where we're going. When I started to avoid the maze, I remember a family member of mine said, Karen, you always felt like you were stumbling, but we never saw you stumble. So why are you coming up with this theory of avoid the maze? And I said, because I always did stumble. And it's glad that you didn't see me stumbling along through life. But I was always trying to be someone else. It wasn't until the day that I decided to be me that made the whole difference. And so there are a lot of people out there who are addicted, whether it be to drugs and alcohol, it could be to exercise, it could be to so many different things. But you have to sort of understand, why are you there? And until you're willing to dig deep, like you have been, you're not going to find the answers. So don't expect mom or dad or your best friend to tell you what is right or wrong with you.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple really interesting points that you brought up, and there's, as a writer, one of my favorite quotes is a Rumi quote, the poet, and it's he says, "What you seek is seeking you." And it's, maybe kind of waxing poetic eloquence, but I think there's a truth in there, which is that, you are already connected to the life that you want for yourself, the skills that you want to acquire, whatever it is that you're desiring. What you're seeking is seeking you, right? And the other thing that you brought up that I wholeheartedly agree with, I say it often when I'm talking about the book or when I'm speaking, like this, is you cannot teach something that can only be learned, and you cannot give something that can only be earned. And it's not to say that we can't use the external world and all of the stimuli in it to help us on our inner, journey and understanding. but rather the real art and the real skill is taking what we learn and then translating it in such a way that it makes sense in our own inner landscape, right? I mean, countless times did I try to read the self-help books, listen to the self-help theories, and apply those things. And I had a hard time sustaining the behavior modification. And I think ultimately that's what there's a few things that this boils down to. One of them is, curiosity, like just being willing to acknowledge my life isn't the way that I want it to be. And why is that? And what can I do about it? And I think another key ingredient is self-awareness, understanding what's going to work for you and being willing to experiment and try and recognize what's not going to work for you, right? Because we're all unique individuals with unique skill sets and unique affinities. But ultimately, I think that final key ingredient really comes down to behavior modification, because we can't know what's going to work for us or not work for us until we give it an honest try, and that is ultimately integrity. We lay down with our own heads on our own pillows at night, for those of us that are fortunate enough to have pillows. And we know what that integrity feels like. Did I give this my all today? Did I give it an honest effort or not? And if we're lying to ourselves in that moment, we stand no chance of creating the life that's possible, because we're not showing up fully, right? And so to go back to this Rumi quote of what you seek is seeking you, it's just a natural law of balance, right? I mean, the universe seeks balance, and you can see that in any number of ways. Nature will express it in any number of ways. Economics, politics, I mean, you see it all over the place. It's a natural law, is balance. And so what you put in is what you're going to get out. And I don't mean to, I'm not at all trying to turn this into like, you just need to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. That's not what I'm saying. The point that I'm trying to make is that it ultimately comes down to a level of honesty and integrity with self, and figuring out what are your tap roots, right? What are these core pieces that you can move around, the levers to pull, the dials to turn, the buttons to push, that are really going to move the needle for you in the direction that you want to go. And as you rightly pointed out, no one's going to be able to do that for you other than yourself. You can go out and learn, and in fact, we should go out and learn and chew through all this stimuli in the external world. But we also need to be able to discern, this is for me and that's not for me. We need to be able to separate the wheat from the chaff. And that only comes through self-awareness and self-discovery.
Listening to you, I think of all the times that my mother would go on a diet, and she'd say to me, why don't you go on a diet with me? You could lose 10 or 15 pounds. And it'd be like, is this a contest that we're going on? I mean, what is it all about? And I'd look at her, and my first reaction is, so you think I'm fat? And, a nice mother would say, well, no, but everybody can lose weight. Because of that, I hated diets, and I refused. By the time I was 21, I will never go on a diet. If I'm going to lose weight, or if I'm going to gain weight, I'm going to change my behavior. I'm going to figure out the right way to do it. And I've done it a couple of times. And most recently, my health was in jeopardy. And the doctor looked at me and he said, what are you going to do about it? And I said, so you're not telling me I'm too old and I can't do anything about it? He said, no. What are you going to do about it? And I took a couple of days of reading documentation and, seeking inside help and talking to my coaches. And I finally said, I know exactly what I need to do. These are the things I need to change. And I took out my toolbox, and I realized there were some tools in there I cannot use. They're not going to work for me today. But I didn't throw them away. They're still there, but I'm using the tools that I know that work. And so for listeners who are listening to this and going, toolbox, what does it look like? Those are your thoughts, your feelings, the energy that you use to heal, to be the person that you want to be. So in your business, Still Point Insight, what kind of tools do you offer your clients?
They're system-based solutions. I think that you articulated a point that I would say that I echo, which is I no longer set what I would call like vanity metrics or goals. I want to lose X percentage of, I want to lose a certain amount of pounds. I want to, whatever, hold a handstand for 60 seconds, like those types of goals. The way that I look at goal setting now is about lifestyle changes, right? And this is for me personally. I'm not interested in losing weight. I'm interested in, eating a nutritional palette that's going to allow me to maintain the weight that I desire, to get to and then maintain the weight that I desire. I don't run to train for marathons anymore. I run because I enjoy it. And, if I happen to sign up for a race or a friend asks, maybe I will, but it's a lifestyle decision. And so I'm looking for the longevity in behavior modification, because anything that has a, for lack of a better term, a quick fix, the crash diet, the, whatever it is, but we know through experience as well as the data would suggest that oftentimes those things are not sustained.
Right.
Right. So anyway, I think I just wanted to double click on that as you made that point, because I think it's really important to think about. I think in the beginning, any goal that you're setting that's health oriented or wellness oriented is great. Though I would encourage anyone who's, going to walk that path to really think about it as a lifestyle change. Is this something that I'll be able to sustain? And if the goal is still important to you, then focus on the goal if that's what's going to motivate you. But as you move your way towards success, spend some time in self-reflection, asking the question, what components of this journey am I going to be able to sustain long-term, if any? Because I think that's really where the meat is.
Right.
But you asked, what services or what solutions do I offer clients? It's all built upon that foundational theory of change. Quick fixes are quick fixes, and they might work quickly, but they're often going to work for a short period of time. So the way that I've translated all of this personal discovery stuff into professional services kind of twofold. One is, the book that I published in February, Soil and Spirit, and the subsequent Awaken guidebook, which has all of the kind of nuts and the bolts, the self-reflection questions, etc., as well as speaking. But when I'm working with organizations, it all has to be translated again, right? Because now we're going from the individual organism to an ecosystem organism, right? Where there's multiple players and interdependent pieces. So it comes down to a lot of the same skills, but a lot different application, very different application. So we're focusing on leadership strategy and organizational effectiveness, i.e. starting at the top and ensuring there's a clear vision and definition of success, right? To bring this conversation full circle. What does success look like? We need to be able to define that clearly so that we can actually measure against the goals that we're setting, which often leads us into business process optimization or business process improvement. I've never met an organization that is completely 100% optimized. Usually there are chips left on the table in some way, shape, or form. There's meat on the bone in some way that we can streamline to create a little bit more bandwidth to bring us to the conversation about employee well-being and engagement. And ultimately, that's why I do the work that I do. Because when I think about some of the existential threats like climate change and social justice, if we're going to solve these challenges at scale, we need all hands on deck. And so I've chosen for a number of reasons to end up, traditionally in the kind of for-profit or nonprofit sector, the business sector, because I believe that that's a way to affect the maximum amount of change and impact But the way that I do that, or the way that we do that, excuse me, it's a very systematic approach. So again, leadership strategy and organizational effectiveness, business process optimization, as well as employee engagement and well-being services. And what separates us, or what I'd like to think separates us from your kind of average consulting firm, is that all of the work that we do has this holistic and integrative approach. So we have our 10-week essentials program, which is kind of, we put our heads together and say, what are the bare minimum skills that we really need to, if we were to walk away on the 11th week and never talk to this organization or anyone in it again, can we deliver these skills and have it be sustained long-term? So we have that 10-week program, which is kind of our phase 1, but we also have a phase 2, which is taking these buckets and usually then looking at the organization and saying, what are the deficits in this organization and where could they stand to further develop themselves? And sometimes it's one area, sometimes it's 2, sometimes it's all 3, but really trying to build from the bottom up, as well as top down, as well as left to right and inside to out. We're trying to take that holistic approach. And so how we do that, it's a lot of qualitative research and system design, because every organization is different. And so we take our background in research and we apply that. And then we're usually developing custom solutions along the way, working with leadership and teams to implement those solutions long-term and really embed them in the organization so that when we step away, when that third party or the outside accountability steps away, the behavior modification can be sustained.
And everything you're talking about in your business, individually, we can take that same format and improve ourselves. And that's what I love about a holistic approach, because when we don't look at the whole, we're missing so many pieces. And that was one of the big things I had to do when, my doctor brought this up. It's like, well, yeah, I can eat better, but eating better is not the whole thing. It means I have to shop better. I have to cook better. And I started making that list. And then I had to turn to my husband, who is part of my everyday circle, and, include him in on it. And luckily, I have a very understanding husband who said, whatever you cook for yourself or whatever you need to bring into the house, that's what I'll eat. And so the two of us have gotten much healthier along the way. But I had to look at it all. And again, it wasn't about, for me, saying, oh, I have to lose 10 pounds, 20 pounds, 30 pounds. It was, I have to get healthier. And I knew what some of those metrics were. It was, reducing my medications within time, reducing my cholesterol so I don't have to take medication. And so that way I had to study what it was that I had to do for me, eating wise, exercise, and even learning how to stay calm, which was not part of my personality. I used to always brag, oh, I'm a type A personality. That's why I'm like this. And it's like, and what's it doing for you?
Yeah, I can resonate with that. Yeah. I think, this is a really complicated subject, whether we're talking about personal development or organizational development. But this is why we take a systematic approach in our work with organizations. It's largely born out of, again, my own personal theory of change, which is lived experience, right? Wellness does not equal well-being, right? So if you're going to change your diet, or you're going to start working out, or you're going to go, have your spa days, or whatever you define as wellness, will not automatically equate to well-being. And in order to really create holistic well-being, we need a holistic approach. And so that starts with just understanding the landscape, right? And so I call these like leverage points or tap roots. Personal well-being, some of us might be familiar with the different domains of well-being, but we need to recognize we have social, emotional, intellectual, spiritual, physical needs, right? We have all these different domains. And then each one of those domains is going to have all these subcategories. right? So you think about physical well-being. Well, there's, aerobic exercise, anaerobic exercise, nutrition, energy, flexibility, right? So that's just the single vertical of
Right.
physical health. We're not even talking, I mean, obviously there will be spillover into emotional health, social health, but it's a system-based approach. It's a systematic approach to understanding the landscape and then designing system-based solutions that are going to be able to sustain long term. Same thing in organization, right? We have, not only do we have different departments, but then we have different theoretical aspects of those organizations. For example, leadership, strategy, the business processes and workflows, employee well-being on a personal level as well as a professional level, and employee engagement. What does that look like? All of these things create an organizational culture. And I think, to your point there earlier about needing this holistic approach, these existential crises that we've created, for ourselves as a species, is because we lost touch with that holistic mindset, particularly those in the West, right? Like, let's just call it what it is, industrial revolution, and this idea that somehow we could dominate or overcome Mother Nature. Somehow the human being was separate from natural law, right? We exist outside those bounds. We're at the top of the pyramid. No, we're not living on this planet. We're living in this planet. We are a part of its ecosystem, right? And so the idea that we could, for example, extract fossil fuels and burn them and expect that there would be no, consequences long term. Well, now 100 years later, real consequences, right? And so this idea that there's nothing wrong with specialization. There's nothing wrong with having an expertise in a particular, vertical or space. That's part of the gift, of our uniqueness as individuals and as a species. But in order to really fully leverage that expertise, we need to understand how it relates to the bigger whole. And there's a place for all of us, right? There's a place for the message bearers, there's a place for the specialists, and there's a place, I'd like to think, for the people who are trying to stitch all these things together, right? To create systems of well-being, or systems that can sustain or enable well-being at scale. And so that's really how I think about my work, right? That's my why. And the book that I released in February is kind of my own personal manifesto around what does this look like at the individual level, but what's the individual's responsibility to the collective? Because these things are interrelated, right? They're not mutually exclusive. And so to think that we could find the quick fix and that it's going to solve all of the problems, we're setting ourselves up for failure to begin with, right? Because this is a domino chain.
Right.
And we need to line up those dominoes in such a way that we can knock them all over. And it's a challenging thing to do, but it's about, again, to bring this conversation maybe back to where we started, it's about understanding our chemistry as individuals. And I mean that literally and figuratively. We all have a unique chemistry, and balancing that chemistry at a biological level, physiological level, emotional, mental level, is the beginning of creating agency so that we as an individual can go out in the world and have the maximum amount of positive impact that's possible. And, again, for those of us in the West, at least it's been my experience, trying to stay healthy is like you're a fish swimming upstream.
Yeah.
Because we're constantly bombarded with, sex and violence and sugar and all of these things that aren't necessarily put there for our own well-being, so it really takes a calculated approach, and it can be overwhelming. And I in terms of what's my purpose in life, I just like to think that it, part of it is trying to simplify that process for other people. 2 decades of going through the school of hard knocks, hopefully I've gained some insights that can, shorten the curve for others.
Well, we certainly appreciate it because, again, avoid the maze doesn't mean that we're going to avoid all those stumbling blocks. But when we get to them, it's being mindful, opening ourselves up, seeing how we can get around it, through it, backtrack. And when we listen to your experiences and the experiences of others on this show, we all get a few extra tools that we can put in that toolbox so that we can live our best life. I have to thank you so much for being with us. All your information will be in the show notes. I also have to tell you, you are from my most favorite area of the country. I love the Twin Cities. I went to high school in the Twin Cities. And I've only gotten back there twice since I graduated, but I'm still friends with so many of the people that I went to high school with. So enjoy the beautiful fall that you guys are going through. Your winter, not so much.
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, we're definitely flyover country, but we fly under the radar too, which I think some of us enjoy. I certainly do. Yeah, we're getting ready for winter, but you know, it's a good reminder for me, at least, philosophically, right? The seasons have changed. And when I travel elsewhere, I mean, there's nothing wrong with being in San Diego where it's 72 and sunny every day, but I really enjoy the seasons change, you know, and you got to find ways to enjoy winter. And some of us just endure it, but you got to find ways to enjoy it.
Well, it's funny that you say that because my son is visiting from Texas. He works down in the Dallas area. And when he arrived on Friday night, it was raining here. And he stood out in the rain because he said they haven't had rain in 90 days. And he's enjoying the cold weather. And I'm just like looking at him like, oh, I think I better go out there and appreciate it myself too. So it's usually what we don't have that we want. But in the meantime, everybody have a great day and enjoy your journey through life. Thank you very much, Ian. Have a great day.
Thank you for the opportunity, Karen.